Dear ladies and gentlemen, we will be kicking off the first event for today, the discussion whether Ukraine's NATO relations are going to survive the elections. And I would now like to invite Ms. Tachynska to announce the topic of today's event and to announce the guests. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to everyone who has decided to kick off their week together with us. And what we're doing today is we're presenting the 8th TRUMAN Index. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I would like to remind you that this is a review of international relations along 4 directions: Russia, the European Union, the United States, and China. Our analytical specialists have been studying these relations quarterly for 2 years. So we're celebrating a small jubilee today. And also we're going to focus on a special topic, Ukraine-NATO, a direction that is monitored by every 6 months. And so we are able to state the development of events there. I will briefly present the results of the TRUMAN Index over the traditional directions. And to discuss the special topic, we have invited a number of experts to have a closer look at Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration. So please welcome Ms. Barbora Maronkova, the director of the NATO Information and Documentation Center in Ukraine. Thank you very much. Kateryna Zarembo, the Deputy Director of the New Europe Center, who is curating the Ukraine-NATO direction in the TRUMAN Index, and also Colonel Hennadiy Kovalenko, the head ad interim of the main HQ for military cooperation and peacekeeping missions of the Armed Forces of Ukraine General Staff. Thank you very much for joining us today. Other analytical specialists are also joining us, including representatives of the New Europe Center, and feel free to communicate with them freely. I would like to remind you that we are having a coffee break after this event, so please feel free to come up to them. We would also like to welcome in our team the head of the Diplomatic Academy, Mr. Serhiy Korsunsky, who evaluated Ukraine's relations with China this time around. Now, just a few words about the methodology. We evaluate all events in bilateral relations depending on the level of contacts and their consequences for Ukraine, and we use a -10 to +10 scale. The TRUMAN Index represents the total average of the events over the period. So the period we're talking about is June to September. For Russia, the TRUMAN Index is -3.2. As we forecast previously, Russia is not playing peacekeeper anymore, and the TRUMAN Index is now going down. On the one hand, you see that we are having a review of bilateral contracts with Ukraine. We have not continued the so-called large agreement, but at the same time, with the approach of the elections in Ukraine, Russia is being reluctant to engage with the current Ukrainian government and is waiting for the emergence of a more comfortable counterpart in Ukraine. And of course, it overshadows, so to speak, the peace process that is stagnating. Next, we've got China. The TRUMAN Index has not changed, and it still rests at 0.69. And unfortunately, we have to state it, everything has stayed the way it used to be. Ukraine is developing the cultural element of its relation with China, sporadically its economical relations, but unfortunately the political level is beyond attention of the highest representatives in the government, and no one is saying anymore that 2018 will be the year of China in Ukraine. Now, the European Union, the TRUMAN Index is 1.95, which represents progress, which is clear since the period has been very active for Ukraine in its cooperation with the European Union. We are mentioning that the summit, the Ukraine-European Union summit, has been quite productive. Ukraine's European aspirations have been acknowledged. It has been highlighted that Ukraine is important as the transitor of gas, and Russia has been labeled the aggressor once more, on the one hand. On the other hand, we must say that the struggle against Nord Stream 2 is still ongoing, and it's very complicated. And there is another issue, the automatic prolongation of sanctions against Russia is not such an obvious issue, and there are now discussions within the European Union concerning that. The next country is the United States, of course, and the TRUMAN index here is 1.22, which is more than it used to be previously, but we've seen higher levels as well. This quarter represented a mix of signals coming from Washington. On the one hand, they made us what made us a little nervous are the meetings between Mr. Trump and Putin. On the other hand, over cybersecurity and energy security, the United States is clearly an ally to Ukraine. Well, there's also been a sad event. Mr. McCain, Senator McCain, has passed away, and in Kiev, the renewal of the Senate membership is viewed in a reserved fashion, as previously it used to be a strong ally to Ukraine, but now it is unclear what to expect. You can have a closer look at the full picture of the quarter if you take a look at the materials we've handed out. Hopefully you have all received them. And now we're approaching our special topic, the Ukraine-NATO relations. I would like to highlight that our agency takes special pleasure in the fact that the participants of the NATO-Ukraine relations have attracted attention from the participants of the process, and we would like to extend our gratitude to Ms. Rasa Yuknevichene, the President of the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO. It is incredibly important, since she is not only an authorized representative of NATO, but also an ex-defense minister of a NATO member country. So now I would like to pass the word to Kateryna, who has penned the Ukraine-NATO analysis. What have these months looked like, and what are the issues that we have to raise now with respect to Ukraine's advance towards NATO? Thank you very much, and good morning, dear colleagues. Yes, the NATO-Ukraine relations over the last half year have been quite dynamic, and we can mention even this week's activity. As Rasa Yuknevich, she hasn't only delivered the introduction to the TRUMAN Index this time, but she is visiting Kiev right now, and she is having high-level meetings. Also this week, the annual national program is being evaluated by NATO representatives, so you can see that the dialogue is ongoing. On the other hand, if we have a look at the situation at the macro level, you get the feeling that English people would call bittersweet. We've got both achievements, and at the same time, we've got a number of events that might have turned out a little bit better for Ukraine. We will probably begin with the NATO summit in Brussels that took place in July, and which for Ukraine has marked more misachievements. I wouldn't call them defeats, but we know that on the one hand, the preceding the months following the previous months, it wasn't clear whether Ukraine would be invited and whether the Commission, the Ukraine-NATO Commission, would have a sitting, and it didn't have a sitting, with pressure from the United States. NATO came forth with a creative format, the North Atlantic Council, including Ukraine and Georgia, where Ukraine had the chance to participate. But the final declaration on Ukraine and NATO never materialized, while the declaration for Georgia did appear. And another disappointment was that the Enhanced Opportunities Partnership, a symbolic instrument, a new status, was not provided to Ukraine, something that Ukraine might have received back in 2014. You know, we probably shouldn't go back to the past like that, but probably back in 2014, when the wave of solidarity with Ukraine was high, when the Enhanced Opportunities Partnership was provided to Georgia, it seemed that Ukraine would have no problem receiving it. But 4 years later, it is still struggling for a membership action plan. Now, NATO member states are being more and more reluctant in supporting Ukraine. Of course, there's Russia that no one mentions, but there's at the same time this reluctancy among certain member states that should we provide Ukraine with any sort of symbolic means, such as the Enhanced Opportunities Partnership, this will be seen as another step towards membership, which the Enhanced Opportunities Partnership is not. So no one would like to encourage these over-interpretations in NATO. To mention the positive things, we might say that the final declaration of NATO member states included very strong wordings on supporting Ukraine, on condemning Russia. It was quite a bit of a surprise, even for the Ukrainian delegation. They didn't expect it to be so strongly worded. And so it happened with strong pressure from the United States and from Canada. This wording ended up in the final document. And what I've mentioned before, the North Atlantic Council with Ukraine and Georgia is a positive thing from the point of view that member states are ready to look for compromises in order to provide some sort of support to Ukraine, perhaps symbolical at the high level. I keep avoiding a single country. There is reason why the declaration never came out and why the high-level meetings never occurred. This is Hungary, a marker now in Ukraine-NATO relations. And currently, the resolution of the dispute between Ukraine and Hungary is both simple and difficult. It's simple, as back in summer, the ministers of foreign affairs and the minister of education reached an agreement on two steps that Ukraine has to take in order to resolve the education law dispute. One is prolonging the transitionary components, and also the second one is excluding private schools out of the scope of the law. While the first step is being actively supported in Ukraine, I have no doubt that the components will be prolonged, as this is dictated by the needs of the Ukrainian educational system. Over the private schools, I'm not quite sure. There is strong opposition to this idea in parliament, since it is feared that Russia is going to use this amendment in order to promote its cultural propagandist activity through schools, through private educational institutions. We at the New Europe Center are not sure whether the Hungarian part understands this clearly, whether this is being clearly communicated, and what the particular arrangements on the time frames are. While these steps are not implemented, we cannot be hoping for a resolution of the conflict and of the deblocking of the Ukraine-NATO Commission. And we have the signal that at the operational level, cooperation between NATO and Ukraine is being blocked by Hungary. And I will probably dwell a little bit on a very important thing, the communication of Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic choice. We know that now we are working on fixing the irreversibility of this choice in the Constitution, whether this is practically possible or not, and also its European aspirations. But we are seeing a tendency that disturbs us concerning the opinion over Ukraine's membership in NATO in various regions of the country. While the general level of approval is pretty high in the country, and overall, there is a strong decline in support in the east and the south. The amount of people who would vote against the idea in the south has grown by 20%, from 42% to 64% this year. In the east, the percentage has always been high, and so the growth has been slower. Also, the level of awareness is very low. Only 1% of the population in the East have reported that they receive enough information and are aware of what's going on and of the perspectives of membership, etc., etc. Finally, we can say that Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration is, of course, a lengthy process. It has been going on for many years. We are now having the national annual program processed for 2019, which will reach a new level of quality, orientated at qualitative, not quantitative indicators, and the service people are now receiving respective training. And there is still this question whether the idea of a clearly formulated goal is present in Ukraine at various operational levels. I will now probably stop, and over these final remarks concerning communication, I would like to probably pass the floor to Ms. Barbora Maronkova, Director of the NATO Information and Documentation Center in Ukraine. And I will address you with a question. These figures that I mentioned over regional support and the growing support to being beyond a bloc, beyond any military alliances. This is the way the question was formulated in the polls, which is why I repeated. Does this mean that our communication efforts are being unsuccessful in the regions of Ukraine?
First of all, thank you to the TRUMAN agency for not only inviting me, but actually including NATO into your reports. We are very delighted to be in the same company with our European Union colleagues and also the United States. Obviously a little bit less so with Russia, but nevertheless I think it is a very useful report and reminder for all of us, both inside and outside of Ukraine, to really have on a couple of pages all the progresses and everything what is happening on in Ukraine's foreign policy. I think it's extremely important, also for the communication that you mentioned, because sometimes I feel, especially being a functionary, being a bureaucrat from a major institution, sometimes I feel we are very much bogged down into our daily routine and daily tasks and daily reports, and sometimes we fail to a little bit look at a more larger strategic picture. And here I think that the Ukrainian-NATO relations, despite the different issues you mentioned and the -7 negative points that we received, I still think there has been a lot done this year. I will not start enumerating all the visits that have come from NATO of different levels, starting with the Deputy Secretary General down to Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs. We'll have Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. Last week we had Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment. We will have colleagues from the military headquarters, from SHAPE, next week here with their NATO days, etc., etc., etc. So I think that the level of engagement, number of meetings, number of visits, number of briefings of different Ukrainian officials at NATO has been really, really, I think huge over the last 9 months of this year, following the previous year. Also, the continued advisory support that my colleagues provide here within the NATO representation in Ukraine continues to be pretty robust, at least to our means, not to mention all that our individual allies are doing, being the United States or United Kingdom or Lithuania, Poland, and many others. I think, therefore, when we talk about NATO-Ukraine relations, what I would suggest is that we really look at the long-term goal, both of Ukraine and NATO, and what we can do jointly to reach this long-term goal. There might be setbacks, there always are, for every single country that was joining NATO, and I can tell you, including my own native Slovakia, where in 1999 we thought we will be invited together with our neighbors Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, only to be told, no, you're staying outside. Which, as you can imagine, was not a nice feeling for the Slovak people, but that made us work harder and be more committed in our path towards both the NATO and EU. So I think every country in its journey to NATO, had to go through a lot of efforts, a lot of reforms, which are never easy, and they require strategic patience, I would say, both on the leadership level, but also on the expert level, because it is really a very, I wouldn't say difficult, but it's a process where every day you have to come and feel very strongly committed to your reforms. And these reforms are important, and they will be reported. My colleague here from the General Staff will surely be able to share with you, as an active serviceman, what it really means to adopt NATO standards and what it's like to be training and being in a mission with NATO operatives, etc., etc. But this is not just purely technical standards that the armed forces or other defense institutions need to adopt, but this is also the wider overhaul of the whole system that the country has, starting with stronger democratic institutions, with independence of media, independence of judiciary, rule of law, etc., etc. I can go down the list. So it is not just about picking and saying, okay, we adopted 555 standards this year, but I think it's really about the overall haul of also the mentality, the processes, the institutions, and how they function. And here I think also, and I believe you mentioned it in your report, the very important adoption of the law on national security earlier this year was an extremely important milestone, and this is exactly what we mean when we keep on saying over and over again that Ukraine needs to focus on wider reforms of democratic civilian oversight and many other things. So I think overall the relations are very rich, extremely frequent encounters. I believe that this year and previous year were perhaps the highest in our mutual relationship ever since Ukraine became the Partnership for Peace partner, and this is really great, and certainly we hope that we will continue doing so. So this was just a couple of remarks from a NATO official. And now to your question about the communication. I think you're absolutely right, and it is slightly disturbing to see the number of opponents to NATO, if I can call it this way, go up again in the East and in the South. This has traditionally been the two regions where NATO support has been very low. However, then we show quite a nice jump after 2014, particularly 2015 and 2016, and now it's going down again. So I guess the logical question there really is, what happened? And I'm not a sociologist, by no means, but I think a few things might have happened, and perhaps someone in the room might help us to understand better. Firstly, I don't think our communication has failed. In fact, the number of visits to, for example, areas like Kherson or Odessa or Mykolaiv has increased dramatically, not just by me and my colleagues from the NATO representation, but by, for example, our Lithuanian contact point embassy, by other representatives of other embassies. My colleagues from the EU delegation are traveling quite often there, having different events, from business opportunities to security, foreign policy discussions. I believe your own New Europe Center was a few weeks ago down there. So I would actually say that there is a lot of activity happening. So the question is, why is it not impactful? And the reason why it is not impactful might be simply because the other side thinks that we are impactful. And in fact, they have increased their own counter activities and counter information activities because they feel and see that there is too much of this Western activity happening, and we don't really like it. So they might have increased their own counter propaganda and counter disinformation. So this is just me guessing out loud here. But I would be really surprised if the people, for example, of Kherson, and sorry to be picking up on Kherson all the time, but it's one of the places that we have visited at least twice this year. And we always had a very active audience, and people were very much interested, and we had great discussions there. So I'll be very surprised if they would not really say that the information they were given was not useful or it was not taken on board. The same in Mykolaiv and other places. So that would be the south. When it comes to the east, here I must be a little bit ignorant, and I apologize what exactly you mean by the east, because for me east is from up north Sumy all the way down to Mariupol, so I'm not sure if I understand your geographic divisions correctly, or they are all more specific regions that you had in your mind.
These are the Donetsk and Lugansk.
Okay. Well, this obviously is a little bit harder. It is a little bit harder simply because, and here I must say myself, we are not that present ourselves. And this is a lesson learned for us and perhaps a reminder that we need to do better in these regions. They might have been a little bit neglected, or they might not have been given the due attention as, for example, the South. But at the same time, we actually do have indications from official administrations in these areas, or from even some civil society activists and NGOs who actually proactively come to our office and they ask for us to come there and provide information and share information and help them with activities. Particularly, I have it in my mind, for example, the Severodonetsk region and area. So again, I think in the east, that's why I was asking what exactly do we mean? Because there are different areas, different regions, and people feel very differently about their security and their own country's stakes in the security. If they are, for example, living close to the front lines, or they live in Severodonetsk or Mariupol, than the ones, for example, living maybe in Kharkiv. On the other hand, we have had very warm welcome and reception in Sumy, where we went last December in the mid of the terrible snowstorm. But nevertheless, we got there after I don't know how many hours of a train ride, but we got there. We were very proud of ourselves. It was our exhibit, NATO Ukraine exhibit. We had a great turnout, very good discussions, especially with the younger generation. So again, I think it depends region to region. Sorry for such a lengthy answer, but we could discuss this for a long time.
Thank you very much. Actually, I think that you're very much correct, because even when we indeed went to Odessa and Kherson a couple of weeks ago, we could see very different attitudes and different questions which we were asked by the local population. So indeed, these sociological regions are purely for the purposes of quantitative analysis and not intending real boundaries. Rather, they are much more nuanced. Я би хотіла подякувати пані Барборі і передати слово.
I would like to express my gratitude to Ms. Barbora, and I would now invite Mr. Kovalenko, Colonel Hennadiy Kovalenko, who is the head ad interim of the main HQ for military cooperation and peacekeeping missions of the Armed Forces of Ukraine General Staff. My question to you is, well, I am not sure about this NATO standards issue. I like clear indications and figures, but I've got this issue. People keep mentioning different figures. Mr. Poltorak mentions 90 standards. The head of the NATO representation mentions fewer. You can also find different figures in other publications, and it's not clear how they calculate the number of standards adopted. So, Ukraine has declared the goal to fully implement NATO standards by 2020. So how do we calculate our achievements?
So many people here without headphones, so with your permission, I will continue in English as well. And thank you, TRUMAN Agency, for inviting me to this discussion. And I absolutely agree with Barbora that we need to increase our efforts and our, let's say, investment for the future, for the information campaign. Speaking about the standards, Kateryna, you're absolutely right saying that not all the nations implemented all the standards, and this is difference with the numbers and messages and strategic narratives, this kind of stuff. Speaking about the standards, I will mention only one standard, the mindset. So I will quote here General Michael Clemenson, who was Baltic Defense College commander 15 years ago, who said at that time to us, to young people, that the hardest distance to cross is 16 centimeters from ear to ear. The mindset. When we cross that, we will be in NATO and we will survive. If we will not, forget about this country. So I will divide my relatively short presentation into two parts, actually. Firstly, I will be speaking about strategic narratives that we are living in. And my second part will be dedicated to the strategy of deterrence, strategy of survivability of our country, where Ukrainian-NATO relations takes pretty much important place. So speaking about the strategic narratives that we are living in, if we are thinking that we are living in the crisis for the short time, let's say 3-5 years, and one sunny day we will be back to peace, and everybody will be, situation will be the same as it was 10 years ago, we are wrong. I encourage everybody to think about the future, and I encourage everybody to analyze the strategic environment that we are living. And I am afraid that the future is not bright for us. We must be ready for the crises. We must be ready for uncertainty and more difficult times. The second narrative that I would like to mention here is some kind of commercialization of the international relations. If you see it was quite a good example about China and the United States. If you think about the international relations or the system of international relations, I think that nations more and more put national interests above the international organizations' interests. And we see a good example of the United States and China. I was actually astonished when I spoke with the representatives from the United States military, my friends from the embassy, and they are pretty much convinced that President Trump will be re-elected for the second term. And I asked why you think so? Because he has done a lot of things to the American economy to be recovered, actually. So commercialization is another narrative or another characteristic of our environment, let's say. The third one is rise of populism and political bargaining. I was lucky enough to speak with some British experts 2 weeks ago in Royal United Service Institute back in London, and they are absolutely certain that Brexit was political bargain, and that was initiative from Prime Minister David Cameron to gain more support to stay within the European Union, but you know what happened. Another issues of populism and political, let's say, political games. Kateryna mentioned here. It's about bilateral relations between Hungary and Ukraine. The third narrative that I would like, or the fourth actually narrative that I would like to mention here is increasing number of state and non-state actors. And right now it's pretty much difficult to develop, for example, Ukrainian policy when we see that different people coming and going. For example, proxy states. We have rising of Taliban back in Afghanistan. We had ISIS issues, and it's pretty much difficult to, let's say, to have coherent and effective policy when we should, or we actually have to deal not only with the state actors but with the non-state actors as well. My final narrative for the strategic environment I would like to mention here is tectonic shifts of the international agreements, international negotiations, and international relations system. What I mean here, for example, the Russian annexation of Crimea and aggression in the eastern Ukraine. It's big question mark about the non-proliferation of the nuclear weapons. Again, when I spoke with the Saudi Arabians, they said pretty much clear, if Iran will have a nuclear weapon one day, then Saudis will have that day after tomorrow. So again, we should think about the consequences of the aggression against Ukraine, not locally, but in more global context. My second part of the short briefing is future development and the strategy, how we will survive and how we will deal with the Russian aggression. So speaking about the strategy, I would defend here rather deterrence strategy, but not the Cold War deterrence, is the past, but new deterrence with the elements of hybrid warfare and the elements of uncertainty and instability. Speaking about strategy of deterrence, I would like to mention here three basic components of that strategy. First is Western policy. Second is channel of communication. And the third is Ukrainian military capabilities, where actually Ukraine-NATO relations belongs to. Speaking about Western policy, I would like to mention here again the three main components. First one is political pressure. Political pressure is pretty much effective instrument, but when we see the political map of the European Union and the other regions, we see that situation is pretty much volatile. I mean, the elections are coming and going, politicians coming to the scene and disappears, and we consider political pressure as pretty much short-term instrument for Russian deterrence. The second part, more long-term or mid-term instrument is economical sanctions. When we're speaking about economical sanctions, we think that right now what we see in Russia, we see the struggle between the TV set and the fridge. When the screen said everything is okay, Russia is rising from the knees, and one sunny day we will be a superpower in the global context, the fridge tells another story. When you open your fridge, you see less food, and you see less incomes for the population. And as you were pretty much we saw the last initiative about prolonging of the pension age in Russia. They caused a lot of tensions back in the Russian Federation. And the third part of the Western approach, and I think it's the most important one, is technological embargoes. You see, the Russians, I mean, the Russian politicians, they are speaking a lot about political pressure. They are speaking a lot about economical sanctions, but they are pretty much silent about technological embargoes. It means that technological embargoes is the most painful mechanism for Russian Federation to be deterred. Speaking about the second part, the channels of communication, I would like to mention here NATO, United Nations, and the European Union as well, bilateral negotiations, and one of the most important, I'm not saying most effective, is Kurt Volker's policy and his meetings with the Russian Federation representatives. So speaking about the second part of the strategy of deterrence, this is the military capability development. I would like to mention here that we have pretty much well-established and well-developed mechanisms and instruments in cooperation with North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I will be speaking from Ukrainian point of view or Ukrainian side. We have pretty much good mechanism of advisory support. What do I mean by advisory support? We have strategic advisors. In spite they are from the different countries, nevertheless, they are helping us of the development and implementation of NATO standards. Speaking about advisory support, we have at the very strategic level, we have DRAB, Defense Reform Advisory Board, belongs to the Minister of Defense and Chief of General Staff. This DRAB, Defense Reform Advisory Board, has American, Canadian, British, Lithuanian, and German advisors, and they help us to create or to develop Ministry of Defense Armed Forces at the very strategic level. At the operational level, we have so-called DIAC, Doctrine and Education Advisory Group, basically the Americans who help us to develop the standards. So what we are doing right now, we are changing this Soviet style, Soviet developed field manuals, doctrines, strategies, concepts in order to meet new challenges and new threats about where I'm speaking before about these challenges and threats. So this we are in quite good position, I mean institutional, because right now we have experience from NATO nations and we have our own experience from the front line. So we know how it used to work with NATO, and we know how we working and how we are defending our country back at the eastern Ukraine. So these new documents, new field manuals, strategies, concepts, they consist of the history or best practices from the other nations and our own experience from the front line. All right, okay, summarizing, two more mechanisms of NATO cooperation and development of the Ukrainian armed forces. We are pretty much sober that one sunny day NATO or other nations can say, okay guys, enough is enough, we don't have enough resources to help you anymore, for example. And we are sober that one sunny day we must rely on our own capacities and our own capabilities. And right now, for the Ukrainian armed forces is excellent opportunity to develop own military capabilities to defend the country with help NATO and the other countries. And I love sometimes, I love the speeches from the NATO side and the other nations saying, Ukraine, don't worry, in long run you will win, or in long run you will become a member of NATO. But the problem is, in long run, all we die. Thank you.
Дякую, пане Геннадію, на цій ноті.
Wow, thank you very much, Mr. Hennadiy. That's quite a satirical note to finish your presentation with. And now I will open up the floor for questions and answers. If you don't, yes, I think we've got about 13 minutes, so please stay brief. Here you go, the gentleman over here. So very briefly, good afternoon, dear friends. My name is Kupchishin Alexander. I am the ambassador and head of the Ukrainian law organization, but the ambassador position is the most important thing for me. Thank you very much to all the speakers. The presentations have been great, and I would like to express my gratitude to TRUMAN agency for these events that we have. You are being more and more noticeable in the Ukrainian media sphere. Excuse the tautology. This is noticeable. Now, a critical remark. I don't like the name of today's event. Are Ukraine's relations with NATO going to survive the election? That is the wrong wording. I feel that we are condemned when we use this number. Survive. That's the wrong message. I would formulate it this way. Are elections going to influence the dynamics in the development of Ukraine-NATO relations? That will be the correct way to put the question. That's the first thing I really wanted to say. The second thing, my dear friends, I'm going to say something you won't like, but please listen to me. We need to stop counting support percentages in the regions. Ukraine is a divided country. We are never going to reach a majority in all regions supporting NATO membership. And so we shouldn't count the percentages. We have to make sure that public opinion raises to necessary levels. And so officials have to act accordingly. I think it is absolutely correct to include NATO membership aspirations into the constitution. This will be a no-return point. As an ex-ambassador to France, I have to mention, when France was joining NATO, the level of support was 41%, and nobody cared. So if we join and we are supported by about 35, 40, 52%, it doesn't matter. We have to make sure that the support levels grow over time. So that's how I see the situation. We really need to change the name. There is no condemnation here. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. So I will reformulate your question. So how are the elections going to mention Ukraine-NATO relations? Ms. Barbora, do you see any danger, and what are you concerned about in this direction?
I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer this question, since I'm not an Ukrainian citizen and I'm not going to vote in your elections.
Do you feel this threat?
And therefore, and we also don't have a crystal ball. I think our relationships have been with Ukraine for 25 years, a little bit more, since Ukraine has joined the Partnership for Peace program. There were different phases of NATO-Ukraine relations. Some were more up, some were more down, some were those who tried to pursue NATO membership, and there were those leaders who were not. So at the end of the day, you're a sovereign nation, and it's the decision of you and your people whether or not you want to get closer to NATO. So I cannot be predicting what will be the result of the presidential elections or anything in that regard for the time being.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Hi, thank you, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for reminding us about French public opinion. I don't know if that was 1960. And I think it's good not to forget that through the 1980s, 1/4 of French and Italian citizens were voting for communist parties that often were pretty Stalinist, at least in the case of France. A couple quick things. I just spent Sunday and yesterday at Parkovi. 180 Chinese businessmen were in town, representing about 150 Chinese companies. I don't know the future of China-Ukraine, but I get the feeling that someone in Beijing gave the green light for Chinese investment in Ukraine. Having worked in Moscow for 8 years and visited the Dalny Vostok a lot, the Chinese are probably the only ones who, behind closed doors, have a lot of influence on Putin, because Putin is now the mladshi brat of Kitai, and it can't be said publicly, but they are very vulnerable there. And so you can draw your own analysis, but like it or not, for better or worse, there will be more Chinese investment in Ukraine. My point, it was a beautiful sunny day today, Baba Lieta, and I walked down from Sofia Ploshets. I stopped by the Roman Catholic Cathedral and looked at the photo from 1937. It was marked planetarium. I wasn't aware the Soviets had turned the cathedral into planetarium. It's an example of how, if you misplay the politics, things can go very bad. I took another 20 steps and I saw the campaign poster of Yulia Vespicha in NATO, safety in NATO. I was wondering if any of you on the stage have reached out to Yulia's people, talked to them about NATO, have any sense of what their convictions are on this issue. Is this simply a campaign slogan that we see all over the city, or is there some real commitment there?
Я прошу, ви не, будь ласка, повторити питання.
Do you mind repeating the question, please? Excuse me.
Ukraine Business News, so I cover business, I don't cover
And the question is,
have any of you reached out to Yulia Tymoshenko's party and discussed NATO, and are they really committed, or is that simply a good campaign slogan to have on the walls of Kyiv?
дуже вам дякую.
Thank you very much. Well, actually, on my side, I can say that I haven't communicated with the Tymoshenko camp, but we have doubts as to her commitment to supporting Euro-Atlantic integration and European integration. As for me, Tymoshenko's policies are still very much grounded in populism, and should she win, and should she acquire political weight in parliament, I really wouldn't expect active de facto movement towards NATO. Are we going to have any more questions? Can I offer a comment?
After Yanukovych became the president of Ukraine, if you ask about the NATO-Ukrainian cooperation, in spite he said that non-bloc status and it was in the law, everything. But from the military point of view, we maintained pretty much the same level of cooperation, or even, and more than that, we have increased our contribution to NATO-led operation in Afghanistan, for example. Yeah, absolutely. I'm not defending him. I'm just telling how it was.
Thank you.
Прошу, чи буде ще запитання, відповідь?
Доброго дня. Андрій Гончарук, старший науковий співробітник Національного інституту стратегічних досліджень, перший секретар посольства України в КНР 25 років тому в першому складі посольства. Я хотів би подякувати TRUMAN Agency за те, що це чи не єдиний аналітична інституція в Україні, яка звертає увагу на Китай як на важливий чинник і на важливий напрямок української зовнішньої політики. Але хотів би звернути увагу на те гасло, під яким сидить шановна президія – час компетентних. Свого часу, коли розпочинався TRUMAN індекс, була задана досить висока планка щодо фаховості розміщених матеріалів. Коли я беру 8-й випуск і бачу, що в ньому всі прізвища китайських урядовців написані з граматичними помилками, то мені, як фахівцю, стає дуже прикро, тому що в китайській мові, яка є мовою ізольованою, є тільки 219 слогів. І ті слоги, які вживає автор в китайській мові, відсутні. Вони не можуть стосуватись китайських урядовців. До того ж, знати прізвище прем'єр-міністра держави КНР – це обов'язок просто звичайного фахівця з міжнародних відносин. І нарешті.
Чи є запитання? Дякую за критику.
І нарешті. Можна писати 2 абзаци про мультфільми, 3 абзаци про мультфільми, писати про шрот, про що завгодно. Але якщо у звітний період була нарада послів, на якій президент України піддав ніщівній критиці посольство України в КНР, саме за те, що воно фактично саботувало проведення діалогу на найвищому рівні, то про це TRUMAN Agency має знати і про це треба писати. А питання таке, що збирається робити в майбутньому TRUMAN Agency для того, щоб в його матеріалах не було таких ляпів. Дякую.
Дякую, пане Гончарук, за критику і дякую за ваш внесок в аналітику TRUMAN Agency. Ви є нашим автором, були нашим автором. Спасибі вам за це. І дякую за пропозиції. Звісно, ми будемо вчитися на помилках, як і будь-які серйозні, компетентні люди, які можуть помилятися. Дякую. Я хочу повернутися до теми НАТО таким запитанням. Пані Барборо, скажіть, будь ласка, чи відслідковує НАТО, власне кажучи, ту саму пропаганду Росії в Україні? Чи відпрацьовує, можливо, якісь контрдії щодо того, що ви згадували Херсон, ви згадували Південь, і про те, що відбувається ось те, що говоримо ми про НАТО, недостатньо, попри те, що говорить Росія, наприклад? Чи будуть якісь посилення в цьому напрямку?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Actually, the issue of Russian propaganda towards NATO and NATO member states, but also partner countries, is a wider topic. So when we talk about our communication efforts as NATO to counter Russian disinformation, we are talking about something more than just Ukraine as such. Why? Because we see, and with the help of a lot of our friends from different civil society, NGOs, journalists, different networks that have been created in Ukraine, outside of Ukraine, in many of our member states, we see that the Russian narratives about NATO are very, very similar, regardless if they are used in Ukraine or in the Baltic states or in Czech Republic or somewhere else. Of course, then there are very specific narratives which are used for particular countries, but the overarching narrative is NATO is bad, NATO is aggressor, NATO has failed its promise, it will not expand eastwards, NATO is encircling Russia, and NATO is preparing militarily and boosting its military defenses close to Russia's border. So these narratives are the same everywhere. Then the question goes deeper, where they start using different historical or geographical or cultural narratives that are then specifically developed for particular countries, whether it's Baltic states or Ukraine specific, or in the Western Balkans, for example, very specific in Montenegro, when Montenegro was planning to join NATO. I think the overall effort of countering Russian disinformation, and we have seen it in the past 4 years, has been really of great cooperation between the governmental, institutional, and non-governmental sector. I think we would not be able to do it without the help of the many individuals and organizations. I'm not going to name all of them because I'm sure I'll forget some of them, and that will not be fair. But really, we engaged in daily tasks and political business, we don't necessarily have the time or the means, but also the skills to be really following the narratives and to be scrolling through the thousands of accounts on social media and obscure articles on different obscure websites, following who is a bot and who is a troll, etc., etc. So this is done by a lot of very enthusiastic and great people, and then they are really wonderful in sharing this with us, be it NATO, be it our individual member states. And I think that's the answer, how to counter this disinformation. We need to work on this together, because individually we will not achieve much. And when it comes specifically to Ukraine, we have compiled at NATO headquarters a set of myths that we find most usually or widely used in Ukraine and in this neighborhood. We compiled those myths, we provided facts and figures, including going and digging through the archives and providing factual information. We have it on the NATO website, we have tweeted it, we have made little videos of it in English, in Russian, in different languages. And now, actually, I have a couple of projects coming up in Ukraine, which will specifically look at these myths, and will try to narrate them, also, of course, in Ukrainian, and in a more, I would say, average citizen-friendly way, because we also understand that we have to attract an average citizen to this kind of discussion. So we have a couple of projects that we specifically want to focus on this.
Thank you.
Напевно, на закуску, якщо дозволите.
If you don't mind, a question from me just to finish up to Mr. Hennadiy Kovalenko. Would you mind telling us the national security law that we have mentioned today, which is an important milestone? It foresees that starting from next year, Ukraine is going to have a civil defense minister and civil deputies, and we have seen quite a few days, just a few days ago, the minister has retired from his military position to assume the civil one. From your point of view, as an officer, how easy is it to assume this civil sort of thinking for a person with military experience? Now, with respect to the responsibilities of the Ministry of Defense, which go down to management, basically, from a military point of view, it is absolutely logical to have a civil Minister of Defense. And you've also mentioned the law on national security. And the working group is now present in Ukraine, including USA, Canada, and UK representatives who are now working together with the chief of the staff, with the representatives of the Ministry of Defense, in order to present recommendations on effectively implementing the national security law. Thank you. Thank you very much to our guests for joining our discussion. And it does not stop here. You are invited downstairs for coffee. So please feel free to approach the speakers and to formulate your questions there. Thank you very much. Enjoy your day and see you next time. Thank you.